Okay, ladies and gentlemen, дуже шановні пани та панове, it's really a great pleasure to see so many of you gathered, so many friends, so many people who I don't know, but I'm glad to meet, for a discussion of Ukraine's prehistoric human past, which is where we are moving now. It was a tremendous amount of work by our team at Ukrainian History Global Initiative to put this together. And as we were putting together this exhibition, which ranges from 20,000 or so years ago to 400 AD, one of the things that came back to us was that it's been a while since in Ukraine there's been a big public event about the distant past. And so I wanted to say I appreciate your being here because we all know how important the contemporary events are. We all have an idea about modern history. We miss sometimes how events further back in the past may be more significant. In your own life, what happened today seems very important, but I assure you that what happened when you were 3 years old was more important for you and who you are, even if you don't remember it. Now, okay, pause and think about that for a moment. If you'll follow the very rough analogy, in prehistory, it's very similar. Things that happened 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 years ago have simply had much more time to reflect forward, to generate causal arrows and patterns than things that happened recently. It may be harder to understand, harder to trace, but that doesn't mean that it's less significant. We're now in a world where archaeologists, such as my colleagues and participants in this project, Albert Hafner, who is a recently emeritus, although I must say extremely youthful looking, and also mountain climbing, professor of prehistoric archaeology at the University of Bern, who has been, among other things, a pioneer in the application of modern technology, and Johannes Müller, who is a professor of prehistoric archaeology at Kiel, and who has undertaken with Ukrainian and other colleagues 4 or 5 years of digs in Ukraine itself. These two colleagues are examples of a transition in which, interestingly, we are now able to learn more faster about the prehistoric periods than we are about the historic periods. And I say this with all humility as a modern historian. The arguments and knowledge that emerge in the history of the 20th century, the novelty, is rather modest. We make many of the same arguments over and over again. We're chasing our tails on a number of subjects. But within the last, let's say, 15 years, the landscape of prehistory has changed as new technologies have merged with old tried and true methods, such as the archaeological dig, to give us much greater, not just more arguments, but I think much greater clarity about the world which used to be so dark. So returning to my very simple analogy, what if you could go back and actually know what you were like when you were 3 years old? What if you could go back to a period where it seems memory does not reach? What if you could go back to the era beyond written records and figure out all kinds of things? That is where we are now, and that is where our discussion this evening is going to lead us. So, Albert, if I could, I'd like to begin with you, and I'd like to ask you if you could, in just the most elementary way, introduce us to the new technologies, or some of the new technologies that have changed prehistory, that have changed archaeology. Give us a sense of what these methods are, what they're called, how they work. And I think in particular, people would be interested to hear about your own personal involvement, because sometimes the new technologies involve archaeologists doing things which are rather Indiana Jones. So please.
Thank you, Tim. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. And yes, already in 19th century, archaeologists were closely working with biologists. For example, checking on grains and wheat and discovering that agriculture really took place in the Neolithic period. So at that time, they did not know how far it was back in time, because that was the big problem to determine the age of archaeological remains. And this problem existed till the 1960s minimum, or even till the 1980s. And I think Johannes and me, we were the first starting in an area where this problem got quickly resolved. And one tool that we use still today, that was radiocarbon dating. And radiocarbon dating uses the decay of unstable isotopes, C14, which we all take in by radiation. Every human being, every plant takes it in. It has a certain decay time, and we can measure this decay time. And this technology started to work after, let's say, the Second World War, but it was highly disputed because it made all constructions of time that archaeologists did by using ceramics and to think how could this be older or younger. They put it totally on top, and for example, some periods went 3,000, 4,000 years older than before, so it was highly disputed. The next step was to calibrate radiocarbon dating by using tree rings. Tree rings, they have an internal clock. Every year they produce a tree ring. When you start counting the tree rings back in time, then you know wood of certain age. When you date it by radiocarbon dating, you can get a much preciser date and you can correct your data. And for example, in radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology, means the tree ring dating, started 1920, but in 1980, we had in Europe the first calendar going back more than 4,000 years, and today it's going back more than 10,000 years. So we can now calibrate even better, and radiocarbon dating was a method that was a long time used, but it's getting now in a total new dimension because it's getting cheaper, that's an argument, and we can go back more in time and use this calibration. So I would say we have a good basis when we know how things old they are. Because on every excavation, the second question you get is how old is this? So that's what people want to know. And that's also let's say the good thing that archaeologists can prove the age of something. So archaeology is about facts, as Indiana Jones told. Archaeology is about facts. If you want to go for truth, go for the philosophy.
The existence of facts is a truth claim, my friend.
Yeah. So
that was philosophy that I just did.
So from chronology, which was like a basic problem during the whole first 150 years of archaeology, new technologies came up after 1980, 2000, and it was first about digitalization, to use this big data amount that was surely laying the basis, and then a huge wave of, let's say, technologies in going to analysis was coming. So a close cooperation between biology, and I would say the biggest invention and the biggest discovery was paleogenetics. So the genomes of humans, the genomes of plants, that was a real breakthrough. Svante Pääbo, he got recently the Nobel Prize, and he got it in the medicine category. So not in biology, but in medicine. And to find out the genomes of people living up to 20,000 years ago, even from the Neanderthals, that is a fascinating tool. And we can individualize persons, mostly from skeletons, of course. And these other technologies like seeing into the bones via stable isotopes or another kind of chemical things, which gives, for example, information on the nutrition of people. We can say they have been eating a lot of meat or they have been eating more vegetables, and we can also start to distinguish people in societies if they had better access to food or lesser access. So it's a question of inequalities, and we can get an information how the people moved, for example. It's possible to say if they died at the same spot where they have been born. In future, we will quite surely be able to say exactly where they have been born. It's just a question of time, this mapping of these stable isotopes. But we can at least say that in many cases, women were, for example, moving in. Women were more stable. But in other cases, we still have open questions. For example, with genetics, we can find out in a group of graves, a man, he had 2 women, or children with 2 women. But we don't know if this woman was simultaneously or one after the other, because then the dating is not precise enough to find this out. So,
women with 2 males, you know?
Yes, or inverse. But then the question, as deep we go with this analysis, we have also always new questions and enigmas coming up.
Could you share with the audience an example of how the existence of these new methods changes how you go into the field? So when we imagine archaeologists, we probably, forgive me, archaeologists, I see you. We imagine a group of people, we imagine someone with a clipboard giving orders, we imagine a hole in the ground and tools and so on. But I find it very interesting that the existence of new techniques means that when you go into the field, you're doing different things. Can you say a bit about that?
Unfortunately, I cannot give an example from Ukraine because I'm mostly working in Switzerland or in the Balkans. But for example, we have a long tradition on dendrochronology in Switzerland, but the Balkans...
Define dendrochronology.
Dendrochronology is a method to use tree rings to produce annual resolution dates. So we can, for example, say settlements in Switzerland, they were started building 3,393 BC. So by annual resolution, we know the history of the settlement, the biography, that it ended after 5, 6, or 15 years. So we have annual resolution of these settlements, and we know in time they are contemporaneous or not. So we went with an ERC project into the Balkans, where we knew there could be similar sites, but nobody had ever heard about dendrochronology there. There was just nothing. So my colleagues told me, that's not so interesting what you do there, because you will find only floating chronologies. That means not fixed in time. But then we found out our chronologies that we have built up, they are around 5,200 BC. And then a Japanese researcher, a young lady, Fusamiyake, she found out that 5,259 BC, there was a solar eruption, and this solar eruption was detected by tree rings in southwest of the US and in Europe. And she concluded that that was a strong solar outburst, bringing a lot of radiation to the Earth, and this solar radiation must be everywhere detectable on the Earth. And what did we did? We did a lot of radiocarbon dating on our tree ring-based chronologies, and we found this 5,259 event from a lake dwelling in the Balkans. So we could then bring together several of these tree ring curves, and we have now built up a whole 1,000-year-old chronology via a solar storm that happened more than 7,000 years ago.
So humans devise new technologies which allow humans to recognize an environmental event 7,000 years ago, which touches on solar energy, right? It's very striking to me that the better sources we have about the distant past, the more all of our history seems to be geohistory, environmental history. This all comes clearer. Johannes, I want to turn to you and ask you about, in general, the very important subject of these, I'm going to call them cities. these urban agglomerations in what's now south central Ukraine. They too are, of course, a history of technology, because they were, you can correct me, but I believe they were first spotted indirectly by aviation, and then as technology has improved, we've been able to see more and more of these ancient cities. With with history, there's a tyranny of writing. So we don't know unless there's writing. But when we have new kinds of technologies, then we have new kinds of sources. I see the historian objecting to the tyranny of writing, I'm sorry. There's also in archaeology, or there was until recently, and I think technology has changed this, a kind of, forgive me, a tyranny of stone, that cities were built of stone. Stone is what you excavate. Within stone, you can find writing and so on. But as technology's improved, we've been able to find other sorts of cities. For example, the oldest cities in the world, in central Ukraine, where stone was not an important building element. So tell us, if you would, Johannes, tell us first about the way that these cities were found. Tell us about your own involvement in digging around these cities, and give us a sense, if you would, also about how recent technology sharpens our picture of what Nebelivka, Talianki, Majdańskie were like.
Yeah, first of all, also thank you very much for the invitation of being here and talking. So you were talking about the technological innovations in archaeological research. One of the main innovations which took place in respect to the spatial detection of archaeological objects happened here in the 1970s by Ukrainian archaeologists. So with geomagnetic devices or with aerial photography, huge areas were prospected, and at that time, this was not possible in Western countries. So it was a qualitative step ahead of many attempts which happened, for example, in Germany or in Poland or in England or in France or in America, to come up with geomagnetic technologies with which you are able to detect really square kilometers. And also the link between aerial photography and this geomagnetic, which detects the disruption in the soil by humans or by animals. There it happened that these huge sites, which are sometimes between 2 square kilometers or 3 square kilometers in size, were detected. And it became obvious, and nobody believed that in the beginning, that we are really talking about sites which existed 4,100 till 3,600 BC, mainly in the area of Uman, and with the concept, with a spatial concept where you got a kind of enclosure around this site, where you got concentric rings of farmsteads organized in a spatial manner around a central empty place. So 3,000 houses. And this stays in contrast, on the one hand, to the other areas of Europe, where this time settlements had a size, let's say, of 100 houses, sometimes 200 houses. We are talking about different dimensions here, also different dimensions of population agglomerations, which are obvious here. And in the end, it became clear, also by isotope analysis, also by analysis of animal bones, human bones is a little bit difficult, because these Tripolye people were, on the one hand, archaeological friendly, because sometimes they burnt their houses, but on the other hand, they were archaeological non-friendly, because they did not have regular burials which we could discover and excavate. So there are not so many human bones, but if we have human bones, and we have a lot of animal bones, it became clear that this appearance of this population agglomerations in the cities was connected to agro-technological changes. So one change, manuring. So manuring of the fields, intensive manuring and intensive grazing of 70% of the animals. And they obviously had these animals, cattle, sheep, not only for meat. Meat didn't play a big role. We know that also from the isotope analysis. But for the manuring of their fields and for the sustainability of the system. And you were asking the question about what's about the Chernosems and what's about the black soils in Ukraine. So at least in this area of the megasites, if you excavate a kurgan, a burial mound from the time around 3200 BC, you will not find Chernosem soils beneath the mound. You will find Chernosem soils beneath this mound. But if you excavate a Tripolye site, you will not find a Chernosem beneath the different structures. And it seems to be obvious that it sounds a little bit strange, but that the living conditions with the opening of the landscape for this huge population agglomerations for agriculture, for this very intensive grazing and farming, the living conditions for the rainbow, the rainworm, were getting much better than before. And this is also something what Charles Darwin was talking about in his book. So this rainworm is somehow also a kind, it sounds strange, an innovation, so an interlinkage between the humans of this mega sites and the animals, the rainworm, and the landscape. So the boundary between the grass steppe and the forest steppe changed, and in a way like it also happened later on sometimes in Ukrainian history. Okay, but this mega sites, I mean, in principle, these are agrarian cities and sustainable cities. And with the kind of agriculture they developed, at least in our view, the erosion of the soil was very small. So it was obviously not an over-exploitation of the environment, which in the end, after 500 years, usually such a mega site had a duration individually of 200, 300 years, led to the collapse. And I think it's a political question, what happened there?
I want to draw you out, if I could, Professor Müller, on the implications for our imagination of what society can be of the shape of these megacities, or these megasites, these cities. Because in our normal imagination of the deep past of history, the oldest cities are in Mesopotamia. They have big stone walls. They have clear centers of power. They have clear centers of worship. They have places where it's clear that humans are exercising power over other humans. Whereas the model of city that we're describing a bit earlier and a bit bigger in what's now Ukraine, as you describe it, is very different. Semicircles of residences, a place to gather in the middle. Since it's Ukraine, I can't help but think of it as a place where everyone would protest, but no doubt that's an anachronism. But it seems to suggest, and you've pondered this in your own work, it seems to suggest a different kind of social organization, the possibility of a different kind of social organization. Also, if I'm not wrong, the relative absence of precious metals and the lack of elite-style burials would seem to suggest I'll let you say what it seems to suggest, but it seems to suggest a different possible line of history than we're used to thinking about.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I would say if we look at there are different concepts of urbanity. And you mentioned Mesopotamia, there are different concepts of urbanity, quite obviously, in history. And you mentioned Mesopotamia. I mean, in Mesopotamia, we have the development of writing. We have the development of bureaucracy. We have the development of central places. We have the development of different social stratifications, starting with the urbanization there, and also a change in the communication devices between the people. So urbanization in a classical way like we know it. So the European answer, which was found here in Ukraine, was obviously quite different. So there is no indication, at least in my view, for social differences between the different households within the 2,700 households, which, for example, existed in Majdanetsk, contemporary in this 2 square kilometers. There is a concept of, how should we call it, community halls, of assembly halls, which are distributed at the trackways and near the central place. So they found, obviously, a kind of political organization in which certain institutionalized inequality did not develop. On the other hand, it seems to be when we are picking, or we are trying to pick, let's say, methods also from, for example, from the economies. And there is also today, so the Gini index, a kind of index to detect or to compare social differences within societies. We calculated such Gini indices for the period before this mega sites, which is also a Tripoli period, and after end of this mega sites, and astonishingly, so before and after these mega sites, inequalities seem to be higher than during the time of these mega sites. So it's a kind of political model, obviously, which was found somehow, we don't know why, with these big cities as areas where you could live in a different world, at least, than before and after.
So the cities are big, old, populous. They help to answer Victor's question about the fertility of the soil of Ukraine, and they suggest to us different lines of history and different political possibilities, which leads me to the theme which I believe the two of you share, and also the theme which in some way Olivia and I landed on, and which I'd like to ask you to speak about for a moment, Albert, and then if you would too, Johannes, briefly. And that is the theme of sustainability. So I look around the room and I see these beautiful exhibits from the Ukrainian Museum, and they range from 20,000 years ago to 400 years ago, probably the Goths. And in a way that's very heartening, because 20,000 years ago, the environmental conditions were very rough and we somehow made it through. The Goths faced some difficulties as well, and somehow they made it through and knocked over and transformed the Roman Empire and founded the first European medieval state. So there have been trials and travails, and we've gotten through. That's one lesson of archaeology, and one lesson of this exhibition, and one lesson of history, and maybe an encouraging one. But we seem to sometimes get through despite ourselves. And my question is, as our glance, as our view gets deeper into the past, Albert, what can we say now that we couldn't say before about the longue durée, the possibility of the longue durée, about what was sustainable?
I would say prehistoric economies were, in a way, limited by the workforce of the people. And what we know is, for example, for the long period, 20,000 years and more ago, that when people were mostly living from hunting and gathering, they did even exterminate animals. We know, for example, the peopling of the Americas led to the whole completely extinction of all these big fauna, which was not in encounter with any predator, so they were easily be killed. 3-4 meter high animals could be killed by humans. So I think they weren't really sustainable. On the other side, we have a big climate change after the ice ages. The ice ages end, or the period of the ice age ends 12,000 years ago, and the situation changed dramatically. We now speak today of a sea level rise of a half meter or a meter that would affect whole Europe, but after the ice age, the sea level rose 120 meters. So that's a total different story. So there was England was not an island, but there was a land between what is today England and the southern Scandinavia. So the sea level rise dramatically. With that came a much better climate, and this led to the development of agriculture. We know agriculture was invented at least at 2 points independently. That was the Near East and that was the Middle America. And these societies, to my opinion, got in a way sustainable or opportunistic. And I would say they did not put all their money on the same horse in betting, but they used various kinds of wheat and barley. They had a group of animals that was quite fixed. There was sheep, goat, pigs, and cattle. But we know that in many periods, people were still continuing to hunting, for example, if they had good opportunistic economies in this special area. They developed quite quickly also transhumans, going up to the mountains and bringing up cattle to the mountains. So the economy got much more diversified. I forgot fishing. And of course, everything that was eatable was collected. All kind of frogs, escargot, whatever was collected. And it was probably children's work. But the economy was very large, so they did not go on one thing. We go, for example, for today, mostly on one grain, that is wheat. Wheat is the dominant grain over the world. Which, if you would have an affection or a virus that attacks wheat, we would all starve. I think these populations 5,000 years ago, they had no insurance. They had to be completely reliant on themselves, on the relatives in the neighboring communities, but they exploited the landscape in a very sustainable way and could therefore also survive. I think that was the good thing, and they developed a lot of resilience against climatic backlashes. We know, for example, from ice core drillings, volcanoes had a big effect. When you have 2 years no harvest, because the sky is more or less covered by clouds, you have a problem. With the last famines were in the 19th century in Europe because of a volcano in the tropics. So I think that's perhaps my vision of sustainability.
So Johannes, I dwelt a bit too lovingly on the mega sites. So we've now reached the end of our time, but we have happily, we've had not only a long reflection on the character of life itself and a chance to think about who we might be given what sort of earth has been co-made. And we've also had a chance to consider how very differently Homo sapiens can live and has lived on this territory. And one of the extraordinary things for me about this project, and I say this with grateful words to Albert and Johannes and our team of archaeologists, one of the things which is striking to me about this project is that it's very hard for me to find another place on this earth where in the last hundreds or thousands of years, there is more variety and more instruction about the different ways that human beings can be. So for giving us a taste of that, I want to thank both of you very much.